Dinosaurs are one of the most spectacular and diverse groups of animals to have ever walked the earth. They came in a huge variety of shapes and sizes, and included some of the most iconic fossil animals such as Tyrannosaurus rex, the armoured Triceratops, and the long-necked Brachiosaurus. According to evolutionary theory, dinosaurs evolved in the Triassic period about 230 million years ago, and dominated life on the land until their extinction at the end of the Cretaceous about 66 million years ago. By contrast, biblical creationists regard dinosaurs as land animals that were created on the sixth day of creation week about 6,000 years ago. In the creation model, dinosaurs coexisted with the earliest humans in the world before the flood, and the dinosaur fossils are a testimony to God's judgment of that world at the time of the global flood. In this talk, I want to look at two areas of creationist research on dinosaurs, and for those who like alliteration, they both begin with the letter T. Firstly, I want us to think about taxonomy, the branch of biology concerned with classification, sometimes also called systematics. Perhaps taxonomy sounds rather a dry subject, but it is in fact one of the most important parts of biology because the classification of organisms underpins everything else that biologists do. And this is no less true for creation biology than for evolutionary biology. As creationists, we want to know which creatures belong to which created kinds. And discovering those created kinds gives us a foundation for everything else. Understanding what changes have taken place within the created kinds, how quickly those changes occurred, how many animals were on board Noah's Ark, and how those animals and their descendants repopulated the world after the flood, and so on. So in the first part of my talk, I want to look at the work creationists have been doing to identify the created kinds, and in particular what we've discovered so far about the dinosaur kinds. Then secondly, I want us to look at taphonomy, the branch of science that deals with all the processes that go on between an animal dying and the discovery of that animal as a fossil. As creationists, we want to know how animals came to be preserved in the fossil record. What were the circumstances of their death, transport and burial, and so on. And so in the second part of my talk, I'm going to look at two examples of creationist research in the area of taphonomy. Firstly, the research that's being done on a remarkable Allosaurus fossil called Ebenezer, and then the work that's being carried out at an extraordinary dinosaur dig in Wyoming, and what we can learn from both of these research projects about the circumstances of the death and burial of these amazing animals during the global flood. Let's begin with a bit of an introduction to dinosaur taxonomy. Dinosaurs were first discovered and described by scientists in the 1820s and 1830s. The first three dinosaurs to be scientifically described were Megalosaurus, named by William Buckland in 1824, Iguanodon, named by Gideon Mantell in 1825, and Hylaeosaurus, also named by Mantell in 1833. In 1842, Richard Owen, the great Victorian anatomist and founder of the Natural History Museum in London, demonstrated that these three reptiles shared features of the hip region that were lacking in all other reptiles, and so he proposed that they belonged to a completely new group that he named the Dinosauria, meaning fearfully great reptiles. Since their first discovery, our knowledge of dinosaurs has grown exponentially, and especially as a result of the so-called dinosaur renaissance of the late 1960s to the present day. This has led to a much more dynamic view of dinosaurs as active, fast-moving animals with complex social behaviours, and it's also led to an incredible surge of new discoveries. Today there are more than 1,000 recognised dinosaur species, more than 85% of which have been named since 1990. In fact, the pace of discovery is faster today than it's ever been. Every year, about 50 new species of dinosaurs are named, almost one per week. And many of those new discoveries are coming from previously underexplored parts of the world, such as China, India, and Africa, joining the more famous and iconic dinosaurs discovered in Europe and North America in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. For the creation biologist, all of this dinosaur diversity presents some obvious questions. How many created kinds of dinosaurs are represented among the 1,000 species currently known? And does the created kind correspond to some already recognised rank in the standard taxonomic hierarchy? Perhaps you're familiar with the standard taxonomic scheme introduced by the Swedish naturalist Carl Linnaeus in 1758, in which similar species are grouped into genera, the singular is genus, genera into families, families into orders, orders into classes, and so on. The dinosaurs as a whole are classified as a superorder, in other words a rank just above the level of order. And within that superorder there are many families, genera and species. It seems likely, given their diversity, that these dinosaurs belong to many different created kinds. But how many? And how can we find out? Over the years, based on clues from both the Bible and from science, many creationists have suggested that the taxonomic rank of family may approximate the created kind. We have the dog family, the cat family, the horse family, and so on. Given this assumption, it's been estimated that there might have been about 50 to 60 created kinds of dinosaurs. That seems a reasonable estimate, but how can we test it? In the 1940s, the creation biologist Frank Lewis Marsh proposed that hybridization between species, in other words the ability of species to interbreed and to produce hybrid offspring, could be used as a test to determine which species belong to the same kind. It was Marsh who coined the term baramin to refer to the created kinds, from the Hebrew words bara, to create, and min, kind. Since that time, many creation biologists have adopted Marsh's ideas and sought to identify the original created kinds, or baramins, using hybridization studies. However, hybridization, although useful, has some obvious limitations. And one of those limitations is that it's impossible to know whether two extinct organisms known only from fossils would have been able to hybridize. In other words, we can't apply Marsh's hybridization criterion to dinosaurs. So where do we go from here? Recognizing the limitations of the hybridization approach, modern creation biologists have proposed a range of different criteria that we can apply to identify the created kinds, besides just hybridization. These include additive criteria, that put species together into the same kind, and subtractive criteria that separate species into different kinds. This new discipline of baraminology, only founded in the 1990s, has now developed into a dynamic field of creation studies in its own right, with its own conferences and its own publications. And new baraminology studies are published every year. So how does baraminology work? It doesn't try to identify each baramin in one go. Rather, it works by a process of successive approximation. Larger groups, called apobaramins, are split up, and smaller groups, called monobaramins, are added to, until all the members of a particular created kind have been identified. For example, we may find evidence suggesting that the theropod dinosaurs should be split up into several different kinds: spinosaurs, allosaurs, megalosaurs, and so on. Or we may find evidence that a particular species of interest should be united with other spinosaurs in a single created kind. The goal is to converge on what we call the holobaramin. the group that includes all the members of the created kind in question, but no members of any other created kind. The whole created kind, in other words. The new toolkit of baraminology also includes some statistical methods that can help us to identify the created kinds. These methods include something called baraminic distance, which measures the percentage of characters that two organisms have in common to determine how similar or dissimilar they are. By characters, we mean traits that help to differentiate species, usually attributes of bones, skulls, and teeth. And there's also something called multidimensional scaling, which is a clustering method that allows patterns of similarity and difference between organisms to be visualized in three-dimensional space. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of these methods here, but there's plenty of literature available if you want to find out more. The point is that these methods, unlike hybridization, can be applied to fossil creatures as well as living creatures. And in recent years, these new methods have been applied to a number of fossil groups, including dinosaurs, with some very interesting results. The first ever baraminology study of dinosaurs was given at the annual meeting of the Creation Biology Society in Rapid City, South Dakota in 2011. I was one of the 3 co-authors. In our study, we analysed 19 dinosaur datasets, and we were able to tentatively identify about 8 dinosaur kinds. The first full-length paper on dinosaur baraminology was published in the Answers Research Journal in 2014. In this study, the author analysed 4 different datasets, all focused on tyrannosaurs. However, the most extensive study so far presented was in 2018 at the 8th International Conference on Creationism in Pittsburgh. The lead author was Dr. Neil Duran of Bryan College in Dayton, Tennessee. This particular study was noteworthy for introducing a new statistical method to the baraminology toolkit. 18 datasets from 2004 were analysed using both the old and new methods, and another 19 datasets from 2009 to 2018 were analysed using only the new method. Several dinosaur kinds were identified in this study. So let's have a look at some of the dinosaur kinds that these studies have now revealed. One of the identified kinds was the Stegosauria, which in the standard taxonomic hierarchy is a suborder, a rank between family and order. Stegosaurs walked on 4 legs and had thin bony plates along their backs and paired spikes on their tails, sometimes on their shoulders too. Stegosaurs ranged in size from 4.5 metres to 9 metres long. The head was typically small, with spoon-shaped teeth and a hard beak at the front. They probably ate short leafy plants and fruits. And our studies indicate that all the species in the stegosaur group belong to a single created kind. Another dinosaur kind was the Pachycephalosauria, also classified as a suborder in the standard taxonomy, somewhere between a family and an order. Members of this group are commonly referred to as bone-headed dinosaurs because they had skulls with a bony dome, and often other types of head ornamentation such as spikes and nodules. Rival males may have butted heads with one another. Some were small, others were much larger, but again they all seem to constitute a single created kind. A third created kind was the Tyrannosauroidea, which is classified in the standard taxonomy as a superfamily, in other words a rank just above the level of family. The most famous member of this group is Tyrannosaurus rex, which was about 14 metres long and would have weighed 8 tonnes. Tyrannosaurs were mostly large animals with small arms and 2 fingers, although there were also smaller forms with longer arms and 3 fingers, but they all seem to constitute a single created kind. A fourth created kind was the Hadrosauridae, classified as a family in the standard taxonomic hierarchy. Hadrosaurs are sometimes known as duck-billed dinosaurs because of their wide toothless beaks, although in life the beak was probably covered in soft tissue. Hadrosaurs walked on two legs but held the body horizontally with the stiffened tail extended for balance. There were two main types, the hadrosaurines with flat-topped skulls and the lambeosaurines with hollow head crests. They were probably members of a single created kind, although some have suggested they may represent two separate kinds. So what can we say by way of summary? Well, so far baraminologists have identified about 20 distinct dinosaur kinds. Our 2011 study identified about 8 kinds, the 2014 study identified 1 kind, and the 2018 study identified at least 17 kinds. Note that the numbers don't add up to 20 because there was some overlap between the studies and they didn't always agree exactly on the conclusions to be drawn. However, this gives you some idea of the current state of knowledge. The total number of dinosaur kinds will of course be greater than this because some dinosaur groups have not yet been studied in detail or have so far given only inconclusive results. For example, more work is needed on the long-tailed, long-necked sauropod dinosaurs, and there are likely to be quite a few distinct sauropod kinds that will add substantially to this total. Another interesting point is that the results so far tend to confirm the earlier intuitions of creationists that the created kind is at or near the taxonomic rank of family. Sometimes it seems equal to a family, sometimes a bit higher in the ranking than a family, perhaps a superfamily or suborder, and sometimes a bit lower in the ranking, perhaps a subfamily. So the family seems a reasonable approximation. So we've made some encouraging first steps towards identifying the dinosaur kinds. And that's exciting because it will eventually allow us to answer many of the other questions that we have. But of course there's still a great deal more work to be done. Well, let's turn now from taxonomy to taphonomy, the processes by which dinosaurs and other organisms came to be preserved in the fossil record. This slide shows a magnificent mounted skeleton of a full-grown adult Allosaurus, one of the most iconic theropod dinosaurs. This is Ebenezer the Allosaurus at the Answers in Genesis Creation Museum in Kentucky, and one of the museum's star exhibits since the 24th of May 2014. Ebenezer is 9 metres long and 3 metres tall, about average for its species. In life, it's estimated that this individual would have weighed more than 2 tons. And Ebenezer the Allosaurus has a fascinating story to tell. The partially complete skeleton of Ebenezer was discovered in the year 2000 by a creationist, Dana Forbes, on his land near Macedonia in the Skull Creek Basin of northwest Colorado, and it was excavated between 2001 and 2002. 139 bones out of a possible 250 were recovered, so the skeleton is about 56% complete. One of the most remarkable aspects of this specimen is the skull, which at about 97% complete and almost 1 metre long is probably the largest and most complete Allosaurus skull ever found. The skull has 53 teeth, each averaging 11.5 centimetres long, including the roots. And in this specimen, even the delicate hyoid bones are intact. The hyoids are the bones that would have anchored the tongue and larynx muscles and helped with swallowing and vocalization. These bones are almost never found intact in fossils, so this is a very significant specimen. Over the last few years, creationists have been doing some very interesting research in connection with this world-class specimen. Firstly, they've conducted a careful field investigation of the site where the skeleton was discovered, to gather as much information as possible about how Ebenezer came to be buried and preserved there. Dr. Andrew Snelling, Director of Research at Answers in Genesis, and Dr. John Whitmore, Professor of Geology at Cedarville University in Ohio, along with some of Dr. Whitmore's students, visited the site in March 2014 to measure the rock section and to sample the dig site, and we'll take a look at what they found. Secondly, in November 2016, the Creation Museum had Ebenezer's skull scanned using computer imaging, which is also revealing more about the life and death of this remarkable animal. And thanks to Dr. Snelling at Answers in Genesis, I'll be able to show you some of those computer scans of Ebenezer's skull in this talk. So let's begin with the site investigation. Ebenezer was found in an Upper Jurassic rock unit called the Morrison Formation, an extraordinary set of rock layers that extends across the Rocky Mountain region from Canada to New Mexico. The Morrison covers more than 1.5 million square kilometres and averages about 75 metres thick. Dinosaurs are found at many levels throughout the formation, and it's famous for its fossil graveyards, including the Carnegie Quarry at Dinosaur National Monument in Utah. Many well-known dinosaurs such as Stegosaurus and Allosaurus have been named from specimens excavated from the Morrison Formation. This photo shows the actual dig site in Moffatt County, Colorado, where Ebenezer was recovered. The carcass was found lying on its left side on a steep slope. The hip and limb bones, if originally present, would have been sticking out of the hillside and may have been eroded away. The Morrison Formation has several subdivisions called members, the uppermost one being the Brushy Basin member, and this is the part of the Morrison in which Ebenezer was found. The Brushy Basin member is notable for containing a huge amount of volcanic material, at least 18,000 cubic kilometres. And this volcanic material must have been transported a great distance from the west, because the nearest volcanic vents are in Southern California and Nevada. The Morrison Formation typically consists of a few resistant sandstone beds and other sandstone layers that are more easily weathered because of their volcanic components. Sampling of the sediments at the dig site reveals that they're typical of Morrison sediments. Poorly sorted sandstones, in other words with a wide range of grain sizes, with angular quartz grains and chert fragments and pebbles from a volcanic source. The bones and the pebbles are found suspended within the finer sandy matrix. These are important clues to the processes that deposited the sediments in which Ebenezer was found. We've already noted that Ebenezer is about 56% complete. The parts of the skeleton that have been preserved include the skull, most of the neck vertebrae, some tail vertebrae and part of an upper leg bone. Some of these bones were still articulated, in other words still in correct anatomical positions relative to one another, suggesting that soft tissues and ligaments were still holding parts of the body together at the time it was buried. That's a strong indication that the carcass was buried rapidly soon after death. However, other parts of Ebenezer were missing, and there are several possible reasons for this. Obviously, some parts of the skeleton are more delicate than others and less likely to be preserved, and some bones may have been lost by exposure and erosion at the dig site. However, another reason why some of the skeleton is missing is that the body appears to have been partially torn apart at the time it was transported and buried. This type of partial preservation seems to be fairly common in Morrison dinosaurs, with specimens missing their head or tail, and others consisting only of articulated vertebrae or limbs. Smaller animals are more likely to be found complete than larger animals. So how was Ebenezer buried here? Can we come up with a scientific model that explains the available information? In the conventional long age model, it's often suggested that these dinosaurs died in dry stream beds during drought conditions, and that the carcasses were later transported and buried by flash floods. However, Dr. Snelling and Dr. Whitmore have proposed another explanation that seems to fit the data better. Their model suggests that at least some of the Morrison Formation sandstones were deposited as catastrophic mass flow deposits rather than by flash flooding. This explains features of the sediments at the dig site better, as well as features of the carcass itself. In this new explanation, massive volcanic eruptions to the west generated catastrophic debris flows that swept through this region at the time of the worldwide flood. Remember, a huge amount of the material found in these sandstone layers has a volcanic origin. The carcasses of animals that were caught up in these mass flows could have been transported intact, especially if they were small. However, shearing forces within the flow would have tended to rip larger carcasses apart, and this may explain why parts of Ebenezer, such as the middle of the body, are missing. Dr. Snelling and Dr. Whitmore plan to write up the results of their field investigation in the Answers Research Journal. Another approach to studying Ebenezer is to examine the skeleton using computer imaging. And so in November 2016, Answers in Genesis's research department contracted with an engineering company in Cincinnati, Ohio, to conduct a computer tomography or CT investigation of Ebenezer's skull. This company's industrial scanner is one of only 5 or 6 like it in the whole of the United States, and it's able to penetrate dense materials such as fossil bone with a high resolution, allowing us to see details of the specimen's internal anatomy without having to cut it into sections as previous generations of scientists had to do. Here you can see CT images of the right side of the skull in the top left, the back of the skull, the image in the top right, the top of the skull in the bottom left, and then at the bottom right you can see the brain cavity, revealing details of the brain lobes and even the cranial nerves. It's expected that these CT scans will allow a full and detailed anatomical description of the skull to be made, revealing details such as the exact placement of the suture lines between the skull bones, some of which are difficult to determine by physical examination. Researchers may even be able to discover whether Ebenezer was male or female. So far as we know, this is the first time an Allosaurus skull has been scanned in this way, making this cutting-edge research, and it's being done by creationists. Answers in Genesis plans to make the scans available to other researchers too, so that comparisons can be made to other specimens of the same species. Well, in the final part of my talk, I want to tell you about a remarkable dinosaur dig that's been going on since 1996 at a remote cattle ranch in northeastern Wyoming. Early excavations at this site uncovered many fossil specimens, and it soon became obvious that this was the location of a major bed of dinosaur bones. Since that time, creationist Dr. Arthur Chadwick and his colleagues have been excavating at the site and recovering about 1,000 fossil bones every year. Dr. Chadwick and his team are using pioneering methods to study this remarkable bone bed. High-precision GPS technology with a resolution of 1 centimetre or less is used to record the position and orientation of each bone. Digital photographs of the bones are also taken at the time of excavation. Using computers, the GPS coordinates are combined with the photographs to reconstruct the bone bed as it would have appeared in the ground. These methods allow the researchers to capture the 3-dimensional relationships between the bones, information that would have been lost by more traditional methods of excavation. The aim is to understand how the bone bed formed. So let's take a look at some of the key observations that have been made by Arthur Chadwick and his team, and the model that they've proposed to explain them. The first observation concerns how many bones are being found at this remarkable site. 20 or 30 bones per square metre is common. In total, about 13,000 bones, bone fragments and teeth have so far been recovered from the 7 quarries that have been dug into the main bone bed, and this is only a fraction of what remains in the ground. Most of the bones come from one type of dinosaur, a large plant eater called Edmontosaurus, although occasionally the remains of other dinosaurs are found, along with the remains of animals such as crocodiles, turtles and fishes. It's estimated that perhaps 25,000 Edmontosaurus are buried here, probably representing more than one herd. Secondly, the dinosaur bones are found in a single layer of mudstone, averaging about 1 metre in thickness. The bones are mostly suspended in the mud and are not directly touching one another. The mudstone layer is thickest in the northwest, and it gets thinner to the south. And above the bone bed is a layer of sandstone with features suggesting that it was deposited rapidly. The contact between the bone bed and the overlying sandstone is sharp and flat. Below the bone bed is a mudstone at the north end and a muddy sandstone at the south end. Another notable feature is that the dinosaur bones in the mud layer are sorted by size, so that the biggest bones, such as the upper leg bones, are typically found at the bottom, and the smallest bones, such as individual vertebrae and toe bones, are found at the top. For example, here we see the bones found in the lowermost 0.2 metres of the bed. And moving upwards through the bed, we see the size of the bones decrease. So that the smallest bones can be seen here in the uppermost 0.2 metres. This is what geologists call a graded bed, and as we shall see, this is a very significant observation. Another observation concerns the articulation of the bones. Occasionally 2 or 3 bones are found in articulation, in other words in the right anatomical positions relative to one another, suggesting that they were joined together by soft tissues at the time they were buried. However, most of the bones are not joined together, and no entire skeletons have been found in the bone bed at all. A final observation. The bones show very little evidence that they were exposed to weathering or bleaching by the sun before they were buried. There are also few signs of damage caused by transport of the bones to the place where they were buried. There are, however, tooth marks on some of the bones, suggesting that the carcasses may have been scavenged before burial. And other bones have been broken, perhaps by being trampled upon by other animals. So how can we put the clues together to work out how this remarkable bone bed was deposited? The bone bed is part of the Upper Cretaceous Lance Formation, an extraordinary rock unit that can be traced across much of Wyoming and has close equivalents in several other states. Conventional geologists think that the sandstones and mudstones of the Lance Formation were deposited slowly by freshwater streams that were meandering across a broad coastal plain about 66 million years ago. And this has tended to give rise to the idea that the bone beds in the Lance Formation built up over long periods of time as migrating herds of dinosaurs tried to cross major river systems, just as herds of wildebeest migrate seasonally today. The idea is that each season some of the migrating dinosaurs would drown, their carcasses being swept downstream to accumulate on a sandbar or a bend in the river. Over time, hundreds of carcasses would build up, and as the river slowly switched position, an extensive layer of dinosaur bones would accumulate. Clearly, this would have been a very slow process, requiring at least thousands of years. However, the discoveries being made by Dr. Chadwick and his team at the dig site in Wyoming suggest that there's something very wrong with this idea. Consider the data we've looked at. First, the bones are found encased in mudstone, which is not a type of sediment normally associated with fast-flowing rivers. Fast-flowing rivers tend to deposit coarse sediments such as sands and gravels. Second, the bones are suspended in the mud and not directly touching one another, and that suggests that both the mud and the bones were carried as a single mass, and that would suggest some kind of mud flow rather than normal river transport. Third, the bones are found in a single layer, and they're sorted by size from the bottom up. This suggests that they were laid down in one go, not in multiple events over a long period of time. If the bones had been deposited over many years, we'd expect to find all types of bones represented at all levels through the layer from bottom to top. Fourth, the mudstone layer contains multitudes of disconnected bones, not the complete or partial skeletons that we'd expect if the carcasses had accumulated one by one on a river sandbar. Putting all of these puzzle pieces together, Dr. Chadwick and his colleagues have proposed a different model, one that they think better fits the data. They've suggested that tens of thousands of dinosaurs must have perished in some kind of catastrophe. Then their bodies must have lain around for just long enough to rot and to be scavenged in order to explain why the bodies had fallen apart, and some showed signs of having been bitten or trampled. However, the bones couldn't have been exposed for too long because they're generally in very good condition. Next, they propose that this rotting mass of tens of thousands of dinosaurs was picked up by a fast-moving mudflow, perhaps triggered by a large earthquake, and swept southwards into deep water, where the bones came to rest suspended in the mud. This would explain the type of sediment in which the bones are encased, the sorting of the bones by size, and other features of the mudstone layer. Now, of course, we can't scientifically prove that these events happened during Noah's flood, but the kind of catastrophic scenario that's being envisaged here is certainly consistent with the biblical flood model. At the very least, we can say that the standard long-age model for the origin of this bone bed fails to explain the evidence. If you'd like more information about the Wyoming dig site, there's an informative website that you can visit, and a technical paper about the bone bed was published in PLOS ONE in 2020. And I also wrote a popular article published in 2020 in Answers magazine. All of the links can be found at the bottom of this slide. So let's summarise what we've said in this talk. We've looked at a number of examples of cutting-edge research that creationists are doing in order to understand dinosaurs from a biblical perspective. This scientific work includes statistical studies of fossil datasets to determine the number of created dinosaur kinds, the examination of world-class dinosaur specimens with the application of computer imaging techniques, field studies to understand how dinosaurs died and were transported and buried during the worldwide flood, as well as long-term excavation projects to unravel the origin and depositional history of major dinosaur bone beds. All of these projects not only make significant contributions to the development of the creationist model of Earth history, but they also add to our overall database of scientific knowledge and show that young-age creationism provides a fruitful and productive framework for scientific discovery. I'd like to thank Dr. Andrew Snelling of Answers in Genesis for the CT scans of Ebenezer and the field photos of the Colorado dig site. And I'd also like to thank Dr. Arthur Chadwick and Summer Rose Weeks for the field and lab photos of the Wyoming bone bed.